My name is Elena Martinez. I'm 68, a retired forensic accountant. For 40 years, I've lived in this house, raised my son here, built a life here. This morning at 6 a.m., everything changed. The pounding on my door wasn't gentle. It was official, authoritative, the sound of someone who had decided I didn't belong in my own house anymore. I pulled on my robe, my walker clicking against the hardwood as I moved to the door. Through the peephole, Deputy Miller stood in his tan uniform, holding papers. Behind him, his patrol car sat quietly. But what made my blood run cold was what I saw across the street. My son James stood beside his black sedan, arms folded, watching. My daughter-in-law Clara was checking her phone. They weren't surprised to see a sheriff's deputy on my porch at dawn. They had been waiting for this moment. Elena Martinez? Deputy Miller's voice was calm but firm. Yes, I have an eviction notice, ma'am. Court ordered. This is my house. I paid off the mortgage 10 years ago. He handed me the envelope. According to these documents, the property was transferred to James Martinez last month. I stared at the signature at the bottom. My name, but not my handwriting. The loops were too large, the slant was wrong. Then it all made sense. James visiting more often, concerned about my paperwork. Taking my mail, changing my bank passwords. That humiliating scene at Bridge Club where he told my friends my memory wasn't what it used to be. She gets paranoid sometimes, he had said. Last week, she accused the mailman of stealing her Social Security checks. That never happened, but everyone believed him. My son had been planning this for months. Forging documents, stealing my identity, making me sound confused and helpless while he systematically took everything I owned. I looked across the street one more time. James was on his phone now, his back turned like I was already gone. That's when he made his biggest mistake. He was about to learn that age is just a number, but 40 years of forensic accounting experience is what really matters. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let's get started. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Elena Martinez's dining room. At 68, she still moved with the precision of her forensic accounting days. Her fingers worked methodically through the plastic compartments of her weekly pill organizer. Blue for morning, white for afternoon. The routine never changed, but something else had. Elena paused, her hand hovering over a thin envelope on the oak table. The Social Security statement felt different, lighter. She had been receiving these monthly documents for 3 years now. This one seemed wrong. She set down her reading glasses and reached for the envelope. The paper crackled between her fingers. Half the usual thickness. Where were the supplemental pages that always came with Medicare updates? The front door opened with a familiar creak. Mom? James's voice carried that particular tone he used when he was in a hurry. Elena looked up as her son stepped into the dining room. At 42, James still had the broad shoulders she remembered from his high school football days. But his eyes moved too quickly now. Always scanning, always calculating. Morning, honey. Elena smiled. You're early today. James glanced at the mail scattered across the table. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Just wanted to check on you before work. His gaze fixed on the opened Social Security statement in her hands. Without asking, he reached across the table and gathered several unopened envelopes. The movement was smooth, practiced. I'll take care of these for you, he said, sliding the mail into his jacket pocket. You don't need to worry about all this paperwork. Elena's fingers tightened around the thin statement. James, I can handle my own mail. I know you can. His smile was patient, the way adults smiled at children. But there's no point in stressing yourself over government forms and bills. Clara and I talked about it. We think it would be easier if we just handled the administrative stuff. The word, administrative, hung in the air like smoke. Elena had spent 40 years managing financial documents. She knew the difference between help and control. James kissed her forehead, his lips brushing against her gray hair. Love you, Mom. I'll call you tonight. The front door closed behind him with a soft click. Elena remained at the table, the thin envelope still in her hands. Through the window, she watched James walk to his black sedan. He was talking on his phone before he reached the car. His free hand gestured sharply as he spoke. She had never seen him this interested in her mail before. The house settled into its familiar quiet. Elena rose from her chair, her walker clicking against the hardwood floor. She had been using the walker for 6 months now, ever since the fall in her garden. James had insisted on it after the doctor's visit. In the kitchen, she filled the kettle with water. The routine motions calmed her nerves. Tea first, then she would think about the mail. About James's sudden interest in her correspondence. As she reached for her favorite mug, her elbow brushed against the fruit bowl. An apple rolled to one side, revealing a small piece of paper underneath. Elena picked up the receipt. The letterhead read, Palmetto Notary Services. The date was yesterday. The timestamp showed 2:30 p.m. Yesterday, James had been at work. At least, that's what he told her when she called his office. The receipt was for $25. Notarization of documents. No details about what documents had been notarized. Elena's hand trembled slightly as she set the paper on the counter. She reached for her Medicare card in her wallet, seeking comfort in its familiar blue and white design. The plastic felt smooth and real between her fingers, but nothing else felt real anymore. The kettle whistled, sharp and insistent. Elena turned off the heat but didn't pour the water. Instead, she stood in her kitchen, listening to the silence of the house. It felt different now, heavy, like a wool blanket on a hot day. She thought about the way James had looked at her mail. The speed with which he had gathered the envelopes. The practiced motion of sliding them into his pocket. He's never been this interested in my mail before, she whispered to the empty kitchen. Her voice sounded small in the quiet space. But the words carried weight. They were the first acknowledgement of something she had been trying to ignore for weeks. The way James spoke to her now. The way Clara avoided her eyes during their brief visits. The sudden concern about her administrative burden. Elena walked back to the dining room. The thin Social Security statement lay on the table where she had left it. She picked it up and read it carefully, line by line. Everything appeared normal. Her monthly benefit amount was correct. The deductions were standard, but where were the Medicare notices that usually accompanied these statements? The supplemental pages that detailed her coverage and any changes to her benefits? She opened the statement again, checking for any missing pages that might have stuck together. Nothing, just the single-page summary she now held. Elena set the document down and looked at the spot where the other mail had been. James had taken at least 5 envelopes. She tried to remember what they looked like. Were any of them from Medicare? From her bank? From the county tax office? The uncertainty gnawed at her. For 40 years, she had built her career on details. On noticing what others missed. On finding discrepancies that revealed larger problems. This felt like the beginning of a very large problem. Elena reached for her phone and dialed James's office number. It went straight to voicemail. James, it's Mom. Could you call me back? I'd like to go through that mail with you. Some of it might be important. She hung up and waited. The afternoon sun shifted across the dining room floor. The shadows grew longer. Her phone remained silent. At 5:30, Elena made herself a sandwich and ate it at the kitchen table. She kept glancing at the Palmetto Notary Services receipt. $25 for document notarization. On a Tuesday afternoon when James was supposed to be showing properties to clients. The pieces didn't fit. But Elena had learned, during her decades of forensic accounting, that pieces that didn't fit were usually the most important ones. As evening settled over the house, Elena made a decision. Tomorrow, she would call Palmetto Notary Services. She would ask about their records from yesterday afternoon. She would find out what documents James had needed to notarize. And she would start paying closer attention to her mail. Elena turned off the kitchen lights and walked slowly to her bedroom. As she passed the dining room, she glanced once more at the table where her mail had been scattered. The empty surface looked violated somehow, like something valuable had been taken without permission. For the first time in months, Elena double-checked that her front door was locked before going to bed. The deadbolt felt solid under her fingers, but it couldn't lock out the unease that had taken root in her chest. If James needed to notarize documents related to her affairs, why hadn't he mentioned it? Why the secrecy? Why the sudden interest in handling her administrative burden? Elena lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once and fell silent. The house creaked as it settled for the night. She thought about the thin Social Security statement, about the missing mail, about the receipt hidden under her fruit bowl like a guilty secret. Something was wrong. She couldn't name it yet, couldn't see its shape clearly. But after 40 years of finding financial irregularities, Elena trusted her instincts. And her instincts were screaming. The last thing she remembered before falling asleep was the sound of James's voice that morning. The patient tone he had used when he gathered her mail. The way he had said, administrative stuff, like she was already too fragile to handle her own life. Elena Martinez had built her career on reading between the lines of documents. Now, for the first time, she wondered what someone might be writing between the lines of her own life. The pounding on Elena's front door shattered the morning quiet like a hammer against glass. 6 a.m. No visitor came at 6 a.m. unless something terrible had happened. Elena reached for her walker, her joints protesting the sudden movement. The knocking continued, sharp and official. Through the frosted glass, she could see a uniform, a badge, a clipboard. "Ma'am? Sheriff's Department." Elena unlocked the deadbolt with shaking fingers. Deputy Miller stood on her porch, his face weathered and tired. He held a manila envelope in his thick hands. "Elena Martinez?" "Yes. I have an eviction notice, ma'am." Court ordered. The words hit Elena like ice water. She gripped her walker harder, her knuckles turning white against the metal handles. "There must be some mistake," she said. "I paid off this mortgage 10 years ago." Deputy Miller's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, I'm just executing the court's order. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." He handed her the envelope. The paper felt heavy, official. Elena's eyes scanned the legal text, but the words blurred together. Property ownership transfer. Quitclaim deed. Failure to pay property taxes. "I don't understand." Elena's voice cracked. "This is my house. I've lived here for 40 years. Ma'am, according to these documents, the property was transferred to James Martinez last month. The new owner initiated eviction proceedings for non-payment of rent." Elena looked past Deputy Miller's shoulder. Across the street, a black sedan sat parked at the curb. James stood beside it, his arms folded across his chest. Clara was there too, checking her reflection in the car's side mirror. They were watching. "My son," Elena whispered. Deputy Miller followed her gaze. His jaw tightened slightly when he saw James, but he said nothing. "The eviction is effective immediately," Deputy Miller continued. "You can contest it in court, but you'll need legal representation." Elena stared at the papers in her hands. The letterhead belonged to a law firm she'd never heard of. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be hers, but the handwriting looked wrong. The loops were too large. The angle was different. "I never signed this," she said. "Ma'am, that's something you'll have to take up with the court." Deputy Miller tapped his clipboard against the doorframe. The sound was sharp, final. Elena noticed how he avoided looking directly at her eyes. "Officer," she said quietly. "How long have you been doing this job?" 15 years, ma'am." "In 15 years, how many eviction notices have you served on 68-year-old women who claim they never signed the papers?" Deputy Miller was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer. "More than I'd like to count, ma'am." Elena nodded. "And how many of those women were telling the truth?" Deputy Miller glanced again at James across the street. "That's not for me to determine, ma'am. I just serve the papers." But something in his tone suggested he had his own suspicions. After Deputy Miller left, Elena stood in her doorway holding the eviction notice. The morning air felt like ice against her skin. Across the street, James was talking on his phone. Clara had moved to the passenger seat, scrolling through her device. They looked like vultures waiting for something to die. Elena closed the door and walked to her kitchen. She spread the eviction papers on the table next to her pill organizer. The morning routine that had seemed so important an hour ago now felt meaningless. She studied the signature line. Elena Martinez was written in black ink, but it wasn't her handwriting. Elena had signed thousands of documents during her career. She knew her own signature better than she knew her own face. The notary stamp was from Palmetto Notary Services, the same company from the receipt she had found yesterday. Elena's hands were steady now. The shock was wearing off, replaced by something colder, more focused. She reached for her phone and dialed Palmetto Notary Services. "Good morning, Palmetto Notary. Hello, this is Elena Martinez. I need to verify a document that was notarized at your office yesterday. Certainly. What's the case number? Elena read the number from the eviction notice. She heard typing in the background. Yes, I have that file. Property transfer documents. Notarized yesterday at 2:30 p.m. Was I present for the notarization? A pause. Ma'am, I'm looking at the signature log. It shows Elena Martinez was present and provided valid identification. What type of identification? Driver's license. Georgia state ID number. The clerk read off a series of numbers. Elena wrote them down. The ID number was correct. But yesterday at 2:30 p.m., she had been at the Medicare Enrollment Center with her friend Dorothy. She had the visitor's log to prove it. Thank you, Elena said, and hung up. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the papers. Someone had used her identification to notarize documents transferring her house to James. Someone who had access to her personal information. Someone who knew where to find a notary service that asked minimal questions. Someone who knew her routines well enough to choose a time when she would have an alibi. Elena thought about yesterday afternoon. She had told James about her plans to help Dorothy at the enrollment center. She had mentioned the time, the location. She had even showed him the blue pen she planned to use to sign the visitor log. The same blue pen she always used for important documents. Elena walked to her bedroom and opened her jewelry box. The small velvet compartment where she kept important papers was empty. Her birth certificate was gone. Her social security card was missing. The original deed to her house had vanished. But Elena was a forensic accountant. She had spent 40 years following paper trails. She knew that every document left traces. Every signature could be analyzed. Every notarization created a record. If James thought her age made her helpless, he had made a serious mistake. Elena returned to the kitchen and opened her laptop. At 68, she wasn't as fast with technology as her son, but she knew how to research. She pulled up the county property records online and searched for her address. The ownership transfer was there, dated last week. But according to the timestamp, the document had been filed electronically at 9:47 p.m. Elena was always in bed by 9:30. She had phone records to prove it. More importantly, the filing required a PIN number that only the property owner should have. Elena had never given that number to anyone. She kept it written in her address book, locked in her bedroom desk. Elena walked to her desk and tried the drawers. The top drawer was unlocked. It was always locked. She pulled it open and found her address book sitting on top, open to the page with her PIN number circled in red ink. Someone had been in her house. Someone had gone through her personal papers. Someone had found exactly what they needed to transfer her property electronically. Elena sank into her desk chair. The violation felt worse than the financial loss. This wasn't just theft. It was betrayal. It was a systematic dismantling of her independence, her security, her right to exist in her own space. But it was also sloppy. Elena reached for a legal pad and began making notes. Timestamps that didn't match. Handwriting that wasn't hers. A notarization that required her physical presence when she was somewhere else. James had underestimated her. He had seen an elderly woman with a walker and assumed she would be too confused or too intimidated to fight back. He was wrong. Elena wrote down Dorothy's phone number. Dorothy would remember their afternoon at the enrollment center. She would remember Elena signing the visitor log with her blue pen. She would remember the specific Medicare representative they had spoken with. Elena also wrote down the name of her former colleague at the accounting firm. Sarah Chen had retired 2 years ago, but she still did consulting work. She specialized in financial fraud cases. More importantly, she knew how to document evidence in a way that courts would accept. The front doorbell rang. Elena looked through the peephole and saw James standing on her porch. He was alone this time. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see tension in his shoulders. Elena opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Mom, I heard about the eviction notice. I'm so sorry you had to find out this way." His voice carried the same patient tone from yesterday morning. The tone that suggested she was too fragile to handle adult information. "Find out what way, James?" "About the house transfer. Clara and I talked about it last week, remember? We agreed it would be better if the property was in my name. For tax purposes." Elena studied her son's face. He looked sincere, concerned, like a loving son worried about his elderly mother's confusion. I don't remember that conversation, Elena said. James sighed. Mom, your memory hasn't been great lately. The doctor said it's normal for people your age, but we need to be realistic about these things. What doctor? Dr. Patterson. At your last appointment. Elena had never heard of Dr. Patterson. She hadn't had a doctor's appointment in 3 months. I think there's been some confusion, Elena said carefully. I know this is hard to accept. James reached out to touch her arm, but Elena stepped back. But Clara and I are just trying to protect you. The house is too much responsibility. The maintenance, the taxes, the insurance. It's overwhelming for someone in your situation. My situation? Mom. James's voice was gentle, patronizing. You're almost 70. You use a walker. You get confused about appointments and conversations. It's not safe for you to live alone anymore. Elena looked at her son. Really looked at him. She saw the calculation behind his concern. The impatience masked as love. The way he avoided direct eye contact when he spoke about her supposed memory problems. James, she said quietly. I want to see the documents I signed. The lawyers have everything. Don't worry about the paperwork. I want to see my signature. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mom, you're getting upset over nothing. This is exactly what I was worried about. The stress isn't good for you. Elena felt a familiar clarity settling over her mind. The same focused calm she used to feel when she found discrepancies in financial records. When the numbers didn't add up and she knew someone was lying. James, she said, get off my property. Mom, this is still my house until a court says otherwise. And I'm telling you to leave. James's careful mask slipped for just a moment. Elena saw anger flash across his face. Raw irritation at being challenged by someone he considered defeated. Fine, he said, but you're going to need help with this, Mom. Legal help. And that costs money. Money you don't have anymore. He walked back to his car without looking back. Elena watched him drive away, her heart pounding but her mind sharp. James had made one crucial error. He had assumed that age and physical frailty meant mental weakness. He had mistaken her walker for evidence of helplessness. But Elena Martinez had spent 4 decades analyzing complex financial crimes. She had testified in federal court. She had helped prosecutors send embezzlers to prison. If James wanted to play games with paperwork, he had chosen the wrong opponent. Elena closed the door and walked back to her kitchen. She picked up the eviction notice and studied it again. This time, she wasn't looking at it as a victim. She was looking at it as a forensic accountant. And forensic accountants knew that every crime left evidence. Elena reached for her phone and dialed Sarah Chen's number. It was time to build a case. The Riverside Community Center buzzed with its usual Tuesday morning energy. Elena's Bridge Club had been meeting here for 15 years, ever since Margaret Hoffman had suggested they needed somewhere neutral to play. Away from husbands and household distractions. Today, Elena wished she had stayed home. She sat at their regular table near the window, trying to concentrate on her cards. But her mind kept drifting to the eviction notice folded in her purse. To James's cold expression when she had asked him to leave her property. Elena, dear, are you feeling all right? Dorothy Chen shuffled the cards with practiced ease. You seem distracted. I'm fine, Elena said, but her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. Margaret leaned forward, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. You do look pale. Are you eating enough? Sometimes when we live alone, we forget to take care of ourselves. Elena forced a smile. Really, I'm fine. But she wasn't fine. She had barely slept last night. Every creak of the house had sounded like someone trying to get in. Every car that passed on the street might have been James, returning with more papers, more claims about her failing memory. Ladies, may I have your attention? Elena looked up to see James standing at the entrance to the community room. He wore his charcoal business suit, the one that made him look successful and trustworthy. Several of the bridge players turned to look at him with interest. Elena's stomach dropped. Sorry to interrupt, James said, walking toward their table. But I need to speak with my mother for a moment. He had never come to Bridge Club before. Elena gripped her cards tighter, her knuckles turning white. James, she said quietly. This isn't the time or place. I'm afraid it is, Mom. His voice was loud enough for the entire room to hear. We need to talk about what happened yesterday. Elena felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes settling on their table. Margaret and Dorothy exchanged glances. The conversation in the room grew quieter as other players turned to listen. James, please, Elena whispered. Can we discuss this at home? I tried that yesterday, Mom. But you became confused and asked me to leave. James pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. I think your friends should know what's been happening. Elena's heart began to race. Nothing's been happening. Mom's memory hasn't been what it used to be, James announced to the table. Her doctor says it's normal for people her age, but it's becoming a real concern. Dorothy frowned. Elena seems perfectly fine to me. That's what makes it so hard, James said, his voice heavy with false sorrow. The episodes come and go. Sometimes she's completely lucid, like now. Other times, she gets confused about basic things. Appointments, conversations, important documents. Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks. James, that's not true. Mom, you called my office yesterday asking about mail that you said I took. But you gave me permission to handle your correspondence weeks ago. Don't you remember? Elena stared at her son. The lie came so smoothly, so naturally, that for a moment she almost doubted herself. I never gave you permission to take my mail. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. He opened it and extracted a sheet of paper, which he placed on the table where everyone could see it. This is a property tax bill, he said. It's addressed to me because Mom signed the house over for her own protection. But yesterday, she insisted she had no memory of the transaction. Elena looked at the tax bill. Her name and address were printed at the top, but in the property owner section, it listed James Martinez. Margaret picked up her reading glasses and studied the document. Well, that does seem official. The problem is, James continued, Mom gets agitated when we try to discuss these arrangements. Yesterday, she accused me of stealing from her. She asked me to leave her house, even though the house legally belongs to me now. Elena felt the room spinning slightly. This couldn't be happening. Not here, in front of her closest friends. Not in the place where she had felt safe and normal just 30 minutes ago. I never signed anything, she said, but her voice sounded weak. Mom, you signed the papers 3 weeks ago. At the kitchen table, you said you were tired of worrying about property taxes and maintenance. You asked Clara and me to take care of everything. The details sounded so reasonable. So plausible. Elena could see doubt creeping into Dorothy's expression. I remember that afternoon, Elena said desperately. You asked me to sign a greeting card for your sick cousin Michael. There is no cousin Michael, Mom. James's voice was infinitely patient. You signed property transfer documents. We discussed it for an hour before you agreed. Elena felt tears building behind her eyes. The conversation felt like quicksand. Every word she spoke to defend herself only made her sound more confused, more unreliable. But I never. The important thing, James interrupted, addressing the table rather than Elena, is that Mom is still safe. Clara and I are handling the financial stuff now, so she doesn't have to worry about it. We're looking into assisted living options that might be more appropriate for someone in her condition. Assisted living? Margaret looked shocked. Elena, is this what you want? Elena opened her mouth to say no, absolutely not, this was all lies and manipulation. But James was already continuing. What Mom wants and what's best for her safety might be two different things, he said sadly. Yesterday, she couldn't remember giving me permission to handle her mail. She accused me of breaking into her house to steal documents. She seems to think I'm part of some elaborate conspiracy against her. Elena watched her friends' faces as James spoke. She saw pity replace surprise. Concern replace doubt. They were looking at her the way people looked at something fragile and broken. Elena, Dorothy said gently. Have you been feeling confused lately? About anything else? I'm not confused, Elena said, but even she could hear how defensive she sounded. James is lying about this. All of it. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret looked uncomfortable. Dorothy glanced between Elena and James with obvious uncertainty. Mom gets paranoid sometimes, James explained. It's another symptom. She thinks everyone is plotting against her. Last week, she accused the mailman of stealing her Social Security checks. Elena had never spoken to the mailman about anything. But the lie was so specific, so believable, that she could see it taking root in her friends' minds. I think we should probably call it a day, Margaret said quietly. Elena, maybe you should go home and rest. I don't need to rest, Elena said, but her voice was shaking now. I need people to believe me. We do believe you, Dorothy said, but her tone was the careful, soothing voice people used with children and invalids. We believe that you're confused and scared. That must be terrifying. Elena looked around the table. These women had been her friends for 15 years. They had celebrated birthdays together, mourned lost husbands, shared gossip and recipes and quiet confidences. Now they were looking at her like she was a stranger. Like she was something to be managed rather than trusted. I have to go, Elena whispered. She gathered her purse and stood up, her walker scraping against the linoleum floor. Behind her, she could hear James's voice, low and concerned, explaining something to Margaret and Dorothy. Probably providing more details about her supposed decline. Elena made it to the parking lot before the tears started. She sat in her car, her hands shaking too hard to put the key in the ignition. James had destroyed her in 10 minutes. With a few documents and the right tone of voice, he had turned her into a confused old woman whose word couldn't be trusted. He had used her age, her walker, her naturally quiet demeanor against her. Worst of all, he had done it in front of the people whose opinions mattered most to her. Elena finally managed to start her car and drive home. The house felt different when she unlocked the front door. Violated, like a crime scene where the evidence had been carefully staged to tell a false story. She walked to her bedroom and sat on the edge of her bed. In her nightstand drawer, she kept a small notebook where she recorded important phone numbers and appointments. Elena flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. Sarah Chen's number. Elena had called her yesterday and left a voicemail. Now she dialed again. Sarah? It's Elena Martinez. I need your help. Elena, I got your message. What's going on? Elena told her about the eviction notice. About the forged signature and the stolen documents. About James's performance at Bridge Club. This is elder fraud, Sarah said when Elena finished. Textbook case. The isolation, the gaslighting, the document forgery. Your son is trying to steal your house. But he made it sound so reasonable. Like he was protecting me. That's how it always sounds. The perpetrator positions themselves as the victim's savior while systematically stealing their assets. Elena, I've seen this before. You're not crazy, and you're not confused. Elena felt something loosen in her chest. For the first time in 2 days, someone was telling her that her perceptions were valid. What do I do? First, we document everything. Every conversation, every document, every inconsistency. Second, we get you legal representation. Third, we fight back. Elena wrote down the name of the attorney Sarah recommended. A woman who specialized in elder abuse cases. After she hung up, Elena sat in her quiet house and thought about the scene at Bridge Club. About the way James had orchestrated the entire encounter. He had known exactly what to say, exactly how to position himself as the concerned son dealing with a declining mother. But he had also made a mistake. Elena walked to her kitchen and opened her laptop. She pulled up her phone records from last week and found the call log for the day James claimed she had signed the property transfer documents. According to her phone, she had made 3 calls that afternoon. 1 to her doctor's office to schedule a routine appointment. 1 to the grocery store to ask about their pharmacy hours. 1 to Dorothy to confirm their plans for the Medicare Enrollment Center. All 3 calls were timestamped. All 3 calls proved that Elena's memory was functioning perfectly on the day she supposedly signed documents she couldn't remember signing. Elena printed the phone records and added them to a growing file folder. She also printed her GPS history from her phone, showing her exact location on the day the documents were allegedly notarized. If James wanted to play the game of documentation, Elena would play it better than he ever could. But first, she needed to do something about Bridge Club. About the seeds of doubt he had planted in her friends' minds. Elena picked up her phone and called Dorothy. Dorothy, it's Elena. About this afternoon. Oh, honey, I'm so worried about you. James seems like such a caring son, but this must be so hard for both of you. Elena took a deep breath. Dorothy, I need you to do something for me. I need you to remember yesterday afternoon at the Medicare Center. Of course I remember. You helped me with the enrollment paperwork. Do you remember what pen I used to sign the visitor log? A pause. Your blue pen. The one you always carry in your purse. Do you remember what time we left? Around 4:30. You were worried about getting home before dark. Dorothy, yesterday at 4:30, I was with you. But according to James, I was at home signing property transfer documents. Which story makes more sense? A longer pause. Elena, what are you saying? I'm saying that someone is lying. And it's not me. Elena hung up and walked to her dining room window. Across the street, James's black sedan was parked at the curb again. She could see him sitting in the driver's seat, talking on his phone. He was watching her house, monitoring her movements, making sure she didn't do anything that might complicate his plans. Elena closed the curtains and walked back to her kitchen. She had work to do, evidence to gather, a case to build. James thought he had won today. He thought he had successfully painted her as a confused old woman whose word couldn't be trusted. He was wrong. Elena Martinez had spent 40 years unraveling financial crimes. She had testified against criminals who thought they were smarter than the law. She had sent people to prison for underestimating the power of documentation and patience. If James wanted to steal her house, he would have to do better than forged signatures and public humiliation. Because Elena was about to remind him what happened when someone tried to defraud a forensic accountant. Elena stood in her darkened living room, surrounded by half-packed boxes that James had insisted she start filling. The sight of her belongings wrapped in newspaper felt like attending her own funeral. 3 days had passed since the scene at Bridge Club. 3 days since James had systematically destroyed her credibility in front of her closest friends. Margaret hadn't called. Dorothy had called once, but her voice carried the careful tone people used when speaking to someone they considered fragile. Elena picked up a framed photograph of her late husband, Robert. His kind eyes seemed to look at her with disappointment. She had let this happen. She had allowed James to reduce her to a stereotype of confused elderly woman who couldn't manage her own affairs. The doorbell rang. Elena looked through the peephole and saw a young woman in a business suit holding a clipboard. When Elena opened the door, the woman handed her an official-looking envelope. Elena Martinez? This is a notice of insurance cancellation. Your homeowner's policy has been terminated due to non-payment of premiums. Elena stared at the notice. The cancellation was effective immediately. The unpaid premium amount was listed as $2,847. But I have automatic payment set up, Elena said. Ma'am, you'll need to contact your insurance company about payment arrangements. After the woman left, Elena called her insurance agent. The conversation was brief and devastating. Mrs. Martinez, your automatic payment was canceled 3 weeks ago. Someone from your family called and requested that all policies be transferred to a James Martinez. We sent confirmation paperwork to your address. I never received any confirmation paperwork. According to our records, James Martinez has power of attorney for your financial affairs. The transfer was legitimate. Elena hung up and walked to her kitchen table. She spread out the insurance cancellation notice next to the eviction papers and the property tax bill addressed to James. Power of attorney. James claimed to have legal authority over her financial decisions. But Elena had never signed a power of attorney document. Or had she? Elena thought back to the greeting card James had asked her to sign. The one for his supposedly sick cousin Michael. She hadn't been wearing her reading glasses. The card had been thick, like expensive stationery. Like legal paperwork. Elena's hands shook as she reached for her laptop. She logged into her online banking account and stared at the screen in disbelief. Her checking account balance was $247. 3 weeks ago, she had $43,000 in checking and another $87,000 in savings. Money she had carefully saved during 40 years of work. Money that was supposed to last her through retirement. Elena clicked through the transaction history. Large withdrawals had been made every few days. Always in amounts just under $10,000, the threshold that required special reporting. Always on days when Elena remembered being away from home. The Medicare enrollment day with Dorothy. A doctor's appointment that had been rescheduled at the last minute. A grocery shopping trip that had taken longer than usual because of a pharmacy delay. Someone had been watching her routine. Timing the withdrawals for when she was guaranteed to be away from home. Someone who knew her schedule well enough to avoid detection. Elena clicked on the savings account. Empty. Completely drained. The final withdrawal had been made yesterday, while Elena was at bridge club being humiliated in front of her friends. While James was performing his concerned son routine, someone was stealing the last of her money. Elena walked to her bedroom and opened the drawer where she kept her bank statements. The drawer was empty. Not just the statements, everything. Her checkbook, her deposit slips, her list of passwords and account numbers. But Elena had backup records. She was too careful not to keep copies. She knelt beside her bed and reached underneath to the small fireproof safe she kept hidden behind old photo albums. The safe was still there, but when Elena opened it with her key, it was empty. Her backup documents were gone. Her birth certificate, social security card, and passport had been removed. The original deed to her house was missing. Even her marriage certificate was gone. Elena sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the empty safe. The violation felt worse than the financial loss. Someone had been in her bedroom, going through her most private possessions. Taking everything that proved who she was and what she owned. Someone who had a key to her house. Someone who knew exactly where she kept her important papers. Elena walked back to her laptop and tried to access her credit report online. Access denied. According to the screen, a fraud alert had been placed on her accounts. All inquiries had to go through a designated representative. The representative was listed as James Martinez. Elena understood now. This wasn't just theft. It was identity erasure. James had systematically removed every piece of documentation that proved Elena's financial independence. Every record that contradicted his narrative of a confused woman who needed protection. Without her bank statements, Elena couldn't prove the money had been stolen. Without her identification documents, she couldn't open new accounts. Without her credit access, she couldn't monitor what other damage might be occurring. Elena was being erased from her own life. The phone rang. Elena answered without checking the caller ID. "Mom, it's James. I wanted to check on you." His voice was warm, concerned. The voice of a loving son worried about his elderly mother. "James, someone has stolen all my money." "Mom, we talked about this. I'm managing your finances now. The money is in a secure account where you can't accidentally spend it." "Accidentally spend it?" "Mom, last month you tried to buy a car. You called 3 different dealerships about trading in a car you sold 2 years ago. The salesman who called me was very concerned." Elena had never called any car dealerships. She had sold her car 2 years ago because her eyesight wasn't good enough for night driving. She had been taking taxis and ride services ever since. "That never happened," Elena said. "Mom, this is exactly what the doctor was worried about. The confusion. The memory loss. It's getting worse." "What doctor?" "I haven't seen a doctor in months." "Dr. Patterson. He prescribed medication for your condition. Clara picked it up from the pharmacy yesterday." Elena felt the room spinning. There was no drive. Patterson. She had no medical condition requiring medication. But James spoke with such certainty, such detailed knowledge, that Elena began to doubt her own memory. "I don't remember any prescription," she whispered. "That's why Clara and I are taking care of these things for you. We don't want you to have to worry about medical appointments and financial decisions. We want you to be able to relax and enjoy your retirement." "By stealing my house and my money?" James's voice changed. The warmth disappeared, replaced by cool impatience. "Mom, nobody is stealing anything. We're protecting you from making mistakes that could hurt you financially. But if you keep fighting us on this, we'll have to consider more formal arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" "Guardianship proceedings. A court-appointed conservator to manage your affairs." "Is that what you want? Strangers making decisions about your life?" Elena felt cold fear wash over her. Guardianship would make James's current theft legal. A court-appointed conservator would have complete control over her finances, her medical decisions, her living arrangements. "No," she whispered. "Then stop fighting us, Mom. Stop calling people with wild stories about fraud and theft. Stop making things difficult for everyone who's trying to help you." Elena realized that James knew about her calls to Sarah Chen. He was monitoring her communications somehow. Tracking who she spoke with and what she said. "James, please. I just want my own life back." "Mom, you can't handle your own life anymore. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for everyone." James hung up. Elena sat holding the phone, listening to the dial tone. She walked to her living room window and looked outside. James's car was parked across the street again. He had been there when she woke up this morning. He was there when she went to bed last night. He wasn't just stealing her assets. He was stealing her freedom, her privacy, her right to exist without surveillance. Elena sank into her recliner, the same chair where she had read books and watched television for 20 years. Soon, it would belong to James. Like everything else in her life. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the mantel clock Robert had given her for their 30th anniversary. In a month, strangers would be living here. The clock would be sold or thrown away. 40 years of memories would be packed into boxes and dismissed as the confused ramblings of a woman who couldn't take care of herself. Elena closed her eyes and tried to think. She was a forensic accountant. She had spent her career following money trails and exposing financial crimes. But this time, she was the victim instead of the investigator. And the perpetrator had done his homework. James had been planning this for months. Maybe longer. He had studied her routines, her weaknesses, her vulnerabilities. He had positioned himself as her protector while systematically removing her ability to protect herself. But he had also underestimated her. Elena opened her eyes and looked at the boxes scattered around her living room. Hidden inside one of them, wrapped in tissue paper with her winter scarves, was a small notebook where she had been documenting everything. Dates, times, conversations, inconsistencies. James thought he had taken all her records. But Elena had learned, during her accounting career, to always keep backups in unexpected places. Elena stood up and walked to the box labeled, Winter Clothes. She unwrapped the notebook and opened it to the first page. Day 1 noticed Social Security statement was thinner than usual. James took mail without asking. Found notary receipt under fruit bowl. Elena had been building a case without even realizing it. Every strange conversation, every missing document, every lie James had told her. She had written it all down. Now she needed to decide what to do with the evidence. Elena walked to her kitchen and made a cup of tea. As the water boiled, she thought about her options. She could call Sarah Chen again, but James was monitoring her communications. She could contact the attorney Sarah had recommended, but she no longer had money to pay legal fees. She could go to the police, but they would see an elderly woman with a walker making accusations against her own son. James had been very careful to make her look like the problem. But Elena had something James didn't know about. Something she had kept secret even from Robert during their 40-year marriage. Elena walked to her bedroom closet and moved aside the boxes of old Christmas decorations. Behind them, taped to the back wall, was a manila envelope she had hidden 15 years ago. Inside the envelope were photocopies of documents from her last major fraud case. The case that had sent Marcus Woodfield to federal prison for embezzling $2.3 million from his elderly clients. Elena had kept copies of everything. Not because she planned to use them, but because she had learned that criminals often repeated their patterns. That someday, someone might need to prove that Marcus Woodfield was a repeat offender. Elena opened the envelope and spread the documents across her kitchen table. Marcus Woodfield's methods were identical to what James was doing now. The gradual isolation of the victim. The systematic removal of documentation. The psychological manipulation designed to make the victim doubt their own perceptions. But Marcus Woodfield had made mistakes. Small errors in timing and documentation that Elena had used to build an airtight case against him. Elena studied her notebook again, this time looking for similar mistakes in James's scheme. The notary timestamp that put Elena in two places at once. The insurance transfer that required her signature but was processed on a day she could prove she was elsewhere. The bank withdrawals that were perfectly timed to her absence from home. James was good, but he wasn't perfect. Elena picked up her phone and dialed the number for Palmetto Notary Services. This is Elena Martinez. I called last week about a document that was notarized in my name. I need to schedule an appointment to review your records. Ma'am, we can't release notary records without a court order. I'm not asking you to release them. I'm asking to see them. As the person who was supposedly notarized. A pause. What exactly are you looking for? I want to see the identification that was presented when my documents were notarized. I want to compare the signature on your log to my actual handwriting. And I want to know if your security cameras were recording that day. Another pause. Ma'am, if you're suggesting that fraud occurred at our location, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking to verify that the notarization was legitimate. If it was, you should have no problem showing me the documentation. Elena hung up and looked at her notebook. Tomorrow, she would visit Palmetto Notary Services. She would also contact the Medicare Enrollment Center and request copies of the visitor logs from the day. She was supposed to have signed property transfer documents. James had built his case on the assumption that Elena was too confused and intimidated to fight back. That she would accept his version of events because challenging him was too difficult. He was wrong. Elena Martinez had spent 40 years proving that criminals always left evidence. That no fraud was perfect. That careful investigation always revealed the truth. Now it was time to investigate her own son. Elena sat in her empty kitchen, the silence pressing against her like a physical weight. The moving boxes were gone now. James had hired people to pack her remaining belongings while she was at what he called a doctor's appointment. There had been no doctor's appointment. Elena had spent 2 hours sitting in a medical office waiting room, only to be told that Dr. Patterson was running late and would she mind rescheduling? When she returned home, her house was hollow. Most of her furniture was gone. Her books, her photographs, her small collection of antique teacups that had belonged to her mother. All packed away or donated, according to Clara's cheerful explanation. We thought it would be easier for you if we handled the transition, Clara had said. Moving can be so stressful for people your age. Now Elena sat at the small card table that had been left for her temporary use. In 3 days, she would be moving to Sunset Manor, an assisted living facility that James had chosen for her. The best place for someone in your condition, he had explained. Elena opened the notebook she had hidden in her coat pocket. Her evidence. Her documentation of everything that had happened since that first strange morning with the thin Social Security statement. She turned to a page dated 2 weeks ago. The day she was supposed to have visited Drive Patterson for the first time. Elena remembered that day clearly. She had been at the grocery store, arguing with the pharmacy about a prescription delay. The prescription had been for eye drops she had been using for 3 years. Hardly the sign of a confused mind. But according to James, she had been at Drive Patterson's office, receiving a diagnosis of early-stage dementia and agreeing to medication management. Elena had never heard of Dr. Patterson before James mentioned him. There was no such doctor listed with her insurance company. But somehow, James had medical documentation supporting his claims about her condition. Elena turned another page in her notebook. She had written down the exact time James claimed she signed the property transfer documents. 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Elena knew exactly where she had been at 2:30 p.m. that Tuesday. She had been with Dorothy at the Medicare Enrollment Center, helping her navigate the complex paperwork for supplemental coverage. Elena had signed the visitor log with her blue pen. She had spoken with the enrollment specialist about Dorothy's prescription needs. She had even mentioned to Dorothy that they should finish by 4 o'clock because she wanted to get home before dark. The Medicare Center had security cameras. They kept visitor logs. Elena had documentation proving she was somewhere else when she supposedly signed away her house. But none of that mattered now. The house was gone. Her money was gone. In 3 days, her freedom would be gone too. Elena closed the notebook and looked around her empty kitchen. The morning light coming through the bare windows made everything look stark and sad. Like a crime scene after the investigators had finished. She thought about Robert, about the years they had spent in this house, planning for retirement, saving money, building a life together. They had never imagined that their careful plans could be undone by the son they had raised and loved. Elena walked to the living room window and looked across the street. James's black sedan was gone. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't watching her house. Maybe he felt secure now. Maybe he believed Elena was completely defeated. Elena returned to the kitchen and opened her laptop. She had been thinking about Marcus Woodfield's case, about the evidence that had sent him to prison for elder fraud. The key had been proving a pattern of deception. Marcus had made the same small mistakes with multiple victims. He had used the same notary service, the same bank branch, the same techniques for isolating his victims from their support systems. Elena pulled up the county court records and searched for recent guardianship cases. The results made her sick to her stomach. In the past 2 years, James had been involved in 5 guardianship proceedings. Always as the concerned family member seeking protection for an elderly relative. Always representing clients who needed help managing complicated estates after their parents became incapacitated. Elena clicked on the details of each case. The pattern was identical every time. An elderly person with significant assets but limited family support. Strange medical documentation appearing suddenly. Property transfers occurring just before guardianship petitions were filed. James wasn't just stealing from Elena. This was his business model. Elena printed the court records and added them to her notebook. She also searched for property records related to each of the guardianship cases. In every instance, the elderly person's real estate had been sold within 6 months of the guardianship appointment. Always at below market prices. Always to companies that James had connections with. Elena stared at the screen, understanding finally clicking into place. James wasn't just a real estate consultant struggling with hidden debts. He was a professional elder fraud specialist who had turned his own mother into his next victim. The realization hurt worse than the theft. Elena had raised James. She had paid for his college education, supported him through his early career struggles, babysat his children when he was building his business. She had been proud of his success in real estate. Now she understood that his success came from systematically exploiting vulnerable elderly people. Elena walked to her bedroom and sat on the edge of the mattress that was the only furniture James had left her. She thought about the other victims in those court cases. Had they tried to fight back? Had they known what was happening to them? Had they died believing they were confused and helpless? Elena picked up her phone and dialed the number for Dorothy Chen. Dorothy, it's Elena. I need to ask you something important. Of course, dear. How are you holding up? James told me about your move to Sunset Manor. It sounds like a lovely place. Elena closed her eyes. Even Dorothy had been convinced that the move was Elena's choice. Dorothy, do you remember the day we went to the Medicare Enrollment Center? 2 weeks ago? Of course. You were so helpful with all those forms. Do you remember what time we left? Around 4, I think. You said you wanted to get home before dark. Dorothy, I need you to do something for me. I need you to call the Medicare Center and ask for copies of the visitor logs from that day. Tell them you need them for your records. Elena, why would you need? Please, Dorothy, this is important. More important than I can explain over the phone. Elena gave Dorothy the exact date and asked her to request security camera footage as well. If it still existed. After she hung up, Elena called Sarah Chen. Sarah, I need to meet with you. But not over the phone. James is monitoring my communications somehow. Elena, where are you? At my house, but not for much longer. Can you meet me somewhere public? Somewhere with security cameras? Elena arranged to meet Sarah at the county courthouse the next morning. A public place where James couldn't interfere without creating a scene. Then Elena did something she hadn't done in months. She left her house and walked to the neighborhood library without telling anyone where she was going. At the library, Elena used a public computer to research Palmetto Notary Services. The business had been cited twice in the past year for inadequate identification verification. Both citations involved elderly clients who later claimed they had never visited the notary office. Elena printed everything she could find. Then she researched the other businesses James had connections with. The companies that had purchased property from his guardianship clients at below market prices. All of them shared the same business address. All of them had been incorporated in the past 3 years. All of them listed James Martinez or his business associates as registered agents. Elena was looking at a comprehensive elder fraud operation that had been running for years. She printed everything and stuffed the papers into her coat pockets. Then she walked home, her mind working furiously. James had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed that Elena would go quietly, that her age and isolation would prevent her from fighting back effectively. But Elena wasn't just any elderly victim. She was a forensic accountant who had spent 40 years building cases against financial criminals. And she had just figured out how to destroy James's entire operation. Elena sat at her card table and opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, Commonwealth vs. Marcus Woodfield, Prosecution Strategy. Below that, she began outlining her case against her own son. Elena Martinez was about to remind James what happened when someone tried to defraud a professional investigator. Even one who walked with a cane. Elena sat in the back corner of the county courthouse library, surrounded by legal research books and printouts from public computers. It was 11 p.m., and the building was nearly empty except for security guards and a few night shift clerks. Sarah Chen sat across from her, reviewing the evidence Elena had compiled over the past 2 weeks. The notebook, the court records, the property transfer documents, the visitor logs from the Medicare Center. "Elena, this is extraordinary work," Sarah whispered. "You've documented a multi-year fraud operation." Elena glanced toward the library entrance. Even here, she felt like James might be watching. "I used to be good at this kind of investigation." "You still are." Sarah spread out the property records Elena had printed. "Look at this pattern. 5 elderly victims in 2 years. Identical methods every time. But James made mistakes with your case." Elena leaned forward. "What mistakes?" "The timing. With his other victims, James was more careful about establishing their incompetence gradually. Months of medical documentation before any property transfers. But with you, he rushed the process. The supposed dementia diagnosis came after the property transfer was already complete." Elena studied the timeline she had created. Sarah was right. The medical evidence supporting James's claims about Elena's condition was all dated after the house had already been stolen. "Why did he rush?" Elena asked. "Probably because you started asking questions too early. Most elderly victims don't challenge the initial stages of the fraud. They accept their family members' explanations about help and protection until it's too late to fight back." Elena thought about the morning she had noticed the thin Social Security statement. If she had simply trusted James's explanation about handling her administrative burden, none of this would have been necessary. "Sarah, I need to ask you something. When we worked together on financial fraud cases, did you ever have to investigate your own family?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "No, but I've worked with victims who did. It's the worst kind of betrayal, Elena. When the person you trust most is the one stealing from you." Elena nodded. The emotional pain was worse than the financial loss. Worse than losing her house or her independence. James had stolen her ability to trust her own perceptions, her own memories. "What do we do now?" Elena asked. Sarah pulled out a manila folder. "I've been in contact with Detective Morrison at the Economic Crimes Division. She specializes in elder fraud cases. She wants to meet with you tomorrow." Elena felt a surge of hope followed immediately by fear. What if James finds out? That's exactly what Detective Morrison wants to discuss. She thinks James's operation is bigger than just the cases you've documented. She wants to use your evidence to build a larger investigation. Elena looked at the notebook where she had recorded every detail of her ordeal. Her careful documentation had become the foundation for bringing down a criminal organization. But it had also made her a target. "Elena," Sarah said gently. "There's something else. Detective Morrison ran a background check on James. He's in serious financial trouble. Much worse than you knew." Sarah handed Elena a printout of James's debt records. Credit cards, business loans, a second mortgage on his own house. He owed nearly $400,000. "Your house and assets weren't just an opportunity for James," Sarah continued. "They were a lifeline. Without them, he was headed for bankruptcy." Elena stared at the numbers. She had raised a son who had become so desperate that he was willing to destroy his own mother to save himself. "Sarah, I need to see the notary records. The ones from Palmetto Notary Services. Detective Morrison already requested them." "Elena, the signature on their log isn't yours. It's not even close. But more importantly, their security camera was recording that day." Elena felt her heart racing. What did it show? A woman signing documents at 2:30 p.m. on the day in question. But it wasn't you. It was Clara. Elena sat back in her chair, the pieces finally clicking into place. Clara had impersonated Elena at the notary office. She had signed the documents using Elena's stolen identification. While Elena was with Dorothy at the Medicare Center, Clara was across town committing identity fraud. "The notary didn't verify the identification carefully," Sarah continued. "They just checked that the name on the ID matched the name on the documents. They didn't compare the photo to the person signing. Elena thought about Clara's appearance. She was roughly Elena's height and build, with similar gray hair. To a busy notary who wasn't paying close attention, Clara could have passed for Elena from a distance. But they have it on video, Elena said. Clara pretending to be me. Yes. And Detective Morrison thinks that video, combined with your documentation, will be enough to get search warrants for James's records. All of his records. Elena looked around the empty courthouse library. Tomorrow, this would all become official. Police investigation, search warrants, criminal charges. The private ordeal she had been fighting alone would become a public legal case. Elena, are you ready for this? Sarah asked. Once you file the complaint, there's no going back. James will know that you're fighting him. And he won't give up easily. Elena thought about the other victims in James's case files. Elderly people who had lost their homes, their savings, their dignity. People who had died believing they were confused and helpless. He's stolen from other people, hasn't he? People who couldn't fight back the way I can. Based on the pattern, almost certainly. Elena closed her notebook and gathered her papers. Then we stop him. Sarah smiled. Elena, can I ask you something? How did you know to start documenting everything so early? Most fraud victims don't realize what's happening until it's too late. Elena thought about her 40-year career in forensic accounting. About all the financial criminals she had helped prosecute. About Marcus Woodfield and the techniques he had used to exploit elderly victims. I spent my entire career learning how these crimes work, Elena said. I just never thought I'd be using that knowledge to investigate my own son. Elena walked home through the quiet streets, her notebook tucked safely in her coat pocket. The documentation that would bring down James's operation. The evidence that would give her back her life. For the first time in weeks, Elena felt powerful instead of powerless. She wasn't just a confused elderly woman whose word couldn't be trusted. She was Elena Martinez, forensic accountant, and she was about to remind everyone why financial criminals had feared her for 4 decades. Tomorrow, she would walk into Detective Morrison's office and file the complaint that would destroy James's carefully constructed fraud operation. She would provide evidence that would lead to criminal charges, asset forfeiture, and justice for all of James's victims. Tonight, she was going to sleep in her own bed in her own house. Because tomorrow, she was taking her life back. Elena unlocked her front door and stepped inside. The house still felt empty and violated, but it no longer felt hopeless. She walked to her bedroom and opened the notebook to the last page she had written. Below her detailed timeline of James's crimes, she added one final entry. Tomorrow justice begins. Elena closed the notebook and placed it on her nightstand. Then she did something she hadn't done since this ordeal began. She slept peacefully. Part 7. Detective Morrison's office was smaller than Elena had expected. With fluorescent lights that hummed softly and stacks of case files covering every available surface. Elena sat across from the detective, her notebook open between them like a bridge connecting her ordeal to official justice. Mrs. Martinez, in 20 years of investigating financial crimes, I've rarely seen documentation this thorough from a victim, Detective Morrison said, flipping through Elena's careful records. You've essentially built our case for us. Elena watched the detective review her evidence. The timeline of events, the property records, the bank statements, the visitor logs from the Medicare Center. Everything she had collected during weeks of careful investigation. Detective, how many other victims are there? Morrison looked up from the notebook. Based on your documentation and our preliminary investigation, we've identified 7 cases over 3 years. Your son and his wife have stolen approximately $1.2 million in assets from elderly victims. Elena felt the number like a physical blow. 7 people, 7 families destroyed by James's systematic fraud. What happens now? We've obtained search warrants for James's home, office, and bank records. We've also frozen his accounts pending investigation. This morning, we arrested both James and Clara on charges of elder abuse, financial fraud, and identity theft. Elena had been waiting for this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, she felt oddly empty. No satisfaction, no relief, just the hollow ache of watching her son's life implode. They're in custody? James made bail this afternoon. Clara is still being processed. Elena, I need to ask you something. Are you prepared to testify against your own son? Elena looked at the notebook filled with months of documentation. Every conversation, every lie, every piece of stolen paperwork. Her life's work had been building cases against financial criminals. Now her final case was against the child she had raised. Yes, she said quietly. I'm prepared. Detective Morrison handed Elena a business card. This is the prosecutor assigned to the case. Ana Gutierrez. She specializes in elder fraud and she's very good at what she does. She'll need to interview you extensively about the timeline of events. Elena put the card in her purse next to her Medicare card, the plastic symbol of the vulnerability James had tried to exploit. Detective, what about the other victims? The people James stole from before me? We're contacting them now. Some of them are no longer alive, but their families deserve to know what happened. Some are still living in facilities they were forced into because James stole their homes. Elena thought about those people. Elderly victims who had died believing they were confused and helpless. Families who had watched their loved ones decline, never knowing that the decline was artificially created by a predator who stole their assets while pretending to provide care. Will they get their money back? Morrison's expression was grim. We'll recover what we can through asset forfeiture, but James spent most of it. The victims will get some restitution, but probably not everything they lost. Elena nodded. Financial crime victims rarely recovered their full losses. Even when the criminals were caught and convicted, the money was usually gone. Mrs. Martinez, I need to warn you about something. James has hired a very expensive criminal defense attorney, Nathan Cross. He specializes in defending white-collar criminals, and his strategy is usually to attack the victim's credibility. Elena had heard of Nathan Cross. He was notorious for portraying financial fraud victims as confused, greedy, or complicit in their own victimization. What will he do? He'll argue that you're suffering from dementia and that your accusations against James are the result of your declining mental state. He'll claim that James was trying to protect you from yourself, and that you've created an elaborate fantasy to explain your confusion. Elena smiled grimly. Detective, I spent 40 years testifying in financial fraud cases. I've been cross-examined by attorneys much better than Nathan Cross. I know, but this is different. This time, it's personal. Cross will try to make you doubt your own perceptions, your own memories. He'll make you question everything you've documented. Elena looked at her notebook. Months of careful records, cross-referenced with official documents, time-stamped with photographic evidence. The most comprehensive case file she had ever compiled. Detective, my documentation speaks for itself. If Nathan Cross wants to argue that I'm confused, he'll have to explain how a confused woman managed to build a federal fraud case with this level of detail. Morrison smiled. That's exactly what Prosecutor Gutierrez said when she reviewed your evidence. Elena, can I ask you something personal? Of course. How did you manage to stay objective throughout this investigation? Most people would have been too emotionally compromised to build a case against their own child. Elena thought about the question. How had she separated Elena the mother from Elena, the forensic accountant? How had she documented her own son's crimes with the same methodical precision she had once used to prosecute strangers? Detective, when James started stealing from me, he stopped being my son. He became a criminal who happened to share my DNA. I investigated him the same way I would investigate anyone who committed financial fraud against a vulnerable elderly person. Even though that vulnerable elderly person was you? Especially because it was me. James thought my age made me helpless. He thought my love for him made me blind. He was wrong on both counts. Morrison closed the notebook and handed it back to Elena. We'll need to keep copies of everything, but the original stays with you. You've earned the right to keep your own records. Elena walked out of the police station feeling lighter than she had in months. The case was in official hands now. Professional investigators would follow the evidence she had compiled. Prosecutors would use her documentation to seek justice. She drove home through streets that looked familiar again. Her house was still mostly empty, but it felt different now. No longer a crime scene waiting to be processed, but a home waiting to be reclaimed. Elena parked in her driveway and noticed that James's black sedan was gone from its usual surveillance position across the street. For the first time in months, no one was watching her house. Inside, Elena sat at her card table and opened her laptop. She had one more task to complete. She pulled up the contact information for the 7 other victims Detective Morrison had identified. The families who deserved to know what had happened to their loved ones. Elena began typing a letter. Dear family members, my name is Elena Martinez, and I am writing to inform you that my son, James Martinez, has been arrested for financial fraud committed against your family member. I have compiled extensive evidence of his criminal activities, and I want you to know that justice is being pursued. Your loved one was not confused. They were not incompetent. They were the victim of a sophisticated fraud operation designed to steal their assets while making them appear mentally incapable. I am a retired forensic accountant, and I investigated this case using the same methods I used during my professional career. The evidence is overwhelming. James and his wife Clara systematically stole from vulnerable elderly people by forging documents, impersonating victims, and manipulating legal and medical systems. If you have questions about what happened to your family member, please contact Detective Morrison or Prosecutor Gutierrez. I have provided them with complete documentation of James's criminal activities. I am deeply sorry that my son caused such harm to your family. As a mother, I am ashamed of what he became. As a forensic accountant, I am committed to ensuring that he faces full legal consequences for his crimes. Your loved one deserved better. You deserved the truth. Sincerely, Elena Martinez. Elena printed 7 copies of the letter and addressed them to the families of James's other victims. Tomorrow, she would mail them all. Tonight, she had one more thing to do. Elena walked to her bedroom and knelt beside the bed. She reached underneath and pulled out the empty fireproof safe where she had once kept her important documents. The safe James had emptied during his theft of her identity. But Elena had one document left. Hidden in a different location, wrapped in tissue paper inside an old jewelry box that James had never thought to search. The original of her forensic accounting license. The certification that proved Elena Martinez was a qualified professional investigator, not a confused elderly woman whose word couldn't be trusted. Elena held the license up to the light, reading her own name printed in official lettering. Tomorrow, she would provide this document to Prosecutor Gutierrez. Evidence that Elena had the professional credentials to build a criminal case. Evidence that James had chosen the wrong victim. Elena placed the license back in the jewelry box and closed the lid. Then she walked to her kitchen and made a cup of tea. For the first time in months, Elena Martinez felt like herself again. Not a victim. Not a confused elderly woman. Not someone who needed protection from her own decisions. Elena Martinez, forensic accountant, who had just completed the most important case of her career. The prosecution of her own son. Part 8. 6 months later, Elena sat on her front porch watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft orange and pink. The morning air carried the scent of jasmine from her rebuilt garden, and the sound of neighborhood children walking to school. Her house looked like home again. Not the empty crime scene James had tried to create, but the warm, lived-in space she and Robert had built over 40 years of marriage. Elena had bought back most of her furniture from the estate sale company James had hired. Some pieces were gone forever, sold to strangers before the investigation could stop them. But enough remained to make the house feel familiar. Elena sipped her coffee from the china cup that had belonged to her mother. Clara had packed it for donation, but Elena's neighbor Mrs. Washington had recognized it at the thrift store and bought it back for her. Some things are too precious to lose, Mrs. Washington had said when she returned it. Elena thought about all the things she had lost and found again. Her house, her financial independence, her sense of safety in her own life. Most importantly, she had found her own strength. The newspaper lay folded on the porch table beside her chair. The headline read, "Local real estate consultant sentenced to 8 years for elder fraud." Elena had read the article 3 times, but it still felt surreal seeing her son's name in a criminal conviction story. James had pleaded guilty to 7 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of identity theft. Clara had received 5 years for her role in the conspiracy. The judge had ordered them to pay full restitution to their victims, though Elena knew most of the money was gone. Elena had testified at James's sentencing hearing, not as a victim asking for mercy, but as a forensic professional explaining the scope of his crimes. She had presented her notebook to the court. walking through the timeline of events with the same methodical precision she had once used to prosecute other people's cases. Your Honor, she had said, this was not a crime of desperation or confusion. This was a systematic operation designed to exploit the trust elderly people place in their families. The defendant calculated every step of this fraud, from the initial document theft to the final property transfers. James had looked at her only once during her testimony. Elena saw no remorse in his eyes, only anger that his carefully planned operation had been exposed by the woman he had underestimated. The judge had been impressed by Elena's documentation. Mrs. Martinez, your investigation of this crime was more thorough than many police investigations I've seen. Your son made a serious error when he chose a forensic accountant as his victim. Elena finished her coffee and walked back into her kitchen. The morning routine felt peaceful again. She filled her pill organizer, the same plastic container that had started this entire ordeal, when she noticed something was wrong with her mail. Today, Elena was expecting a visitor. Sarah Chen was bringing lunch and the final paperwork from the restitution settlement. Elena had recovered about 60% of her stolen assets. Not everything, but enough to maintain her independence. More importantly, Elena had something she valued more than money. She had her credibility back. Her friends from Bridge Club had apologized for doubting her. Margaret and Dorothy now introduced Elena to new people as the woman who solved her own fraud case. The doorbell rang at exactly noon. Sarah stood on the porch holding 2 bags of takeout food and a manila folder thick with legal documents. Elena, you look wonderful, Sarah said as they hugged. Retirement seems to agree with you. Elena laughed. I'm not sure investigating my own son's crimes counts as retirement. They sat at Elena's dining room table, the same oak table where this story had begun, with a thin Social Security statement and a stolen piece of mail. Sarah, I need to ask you something. Do you think I did the right thing? Prosecuting James? Sarah set down her fork and looked at Elena seriously. Elena, you saved 7 families from believing their loved ones died confused and helpless. You recovered stolen assets and prevented James from victimizing other elderly people. How could that not be the right thing? Elena nodded, but the question still haunted her quiet moments. He was my son. He was. But he stopped being your son when he chose to steal your life rather than ask for your help. Elena thought about the financial records Detective Morrison had shared with her. James's debt problems had been serious but not insurmountable. A legitimate loan from Elena could have solved his immediate crisis without destroying either of their lives. Instead, James had chosen to view his elderly mother as an opportunity rather than a person. He had calculated her vulnerability and exploited it systematically. Elena, Sarah said gently, have you thought about what you want to do now? You're healthy, financially secure again, living independently in your own home. You have choices. Elena had been thinking about exactly that question. At 71, she was too old to return to formal employment, but too young and too sharp to simply fade into quiet retirement. I've been contacted by the district attorney's office, Elena said. They want me to consult on other elder fraud cases. Help train investigators to recognize the patterns I documented. That sounds perfect for you. I'm also thinking about writing. Maybe a book about how elderly people can protect themselves from financial predators, including family members who might exploit their trust. Elena looked around her dining room, at the photographs and mementos that told the story of a life fully lived. She thought about Robert, about the years they had spent building security and stability. About how quickly that security could be stolen by someone who understood the system well enough to manipulate it. Sarah, I keep thinking about something James said to me. He told me I couldn't handle my own life anymore. That I needed protection from my own decisions. But you proved him wrong. I proved that age doesn't equal helplessness. That using a walker doesn't mean your mind is weak. That trusting your family doesn't make you stupid. Elena stood and walked to her window, looking out at the neighborhood where she had lived for 4 decades. Children playing in yards, neighbors talking over fences, the ordinary life of a community where people looked out for each other. Sarah, James could have been part of this. He could have helped me age gracefully in my own home, supported my independence while providing backup when I needed it. Instead, he chose to destroy everything I had built. That was his choice, Elena. Not yours. Elena returned to the table and picked up the legal documents Sarah had brought. Settlement papers, restitution schedules, official closure of a case that had consumed her life for 8 months. You know what's strange? Elena said. I'm stronger now than I was before this happened. James thought stealing my assets would make me helpless. Instead, it reminded me of what I'm capable of. Elena walked Sarah to the door, then returned to her porch to finish her afternoon tea. The same porch where she had once sat in fear, watching James's car monitor her movements. Now it felt like a peaceful place to observe the world and plan her future. Elena opened her notebook, the careful documentation that had brought down a criminal operation and restored her life. She turned to a fresh page and began writing. Chapter 1: The morning I realized my son was stealing my life. Elena Martinez was writing her book. Not just about elder fraud, but about the strength that people discover when they refuse to be victims. About the power that comes from fighting back against those who underestimate your intelligence because of your age. About the day a 71-year-old forensic accountant reminded her criminal son what happened when you chose the wrong target. As Elena wrote, the afternoon sun shifted across her porch, warming her shoulders and illuminating the pages. She thought about the other elderly people who might read her words someday. People facing their own struggles with trust, independence, and family relationships. People who needed to know that age could bring wisdom instead of vulnerability. That experience could be a weapon against those who sought to exploit it. Elena finished the first page and looked up at her neighborhood. The same view she had seen thousands of times, but now it looked different. Not like the place where she had been victimized, but like the place where she had fought back and won. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything Elena went through means something today. The evening light was fading now, painting her porch in gentle shadows. Elena closed her notebook and prepared to go inside. Tomorrow, she would continue writing. She would also meet with Detective Morrison about 3 new elder fraud cases that needed her expertise. Elena Martinez, at 71, had found her calling again. Not as a victim of crime, but as a guardian against it. Not as a confused elderly woman who needed protection, but as a professional investigator who protected others. She locked her front door and turned off the porch light, secure in her own home and in her own strength. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. Thank you for spending this time with me.